Well, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, has deployed a mission to the Democratic Republic of Congo to assist the Congolese government in restoring peace and security in the eastern parts of the country. Now, this comes after the recent withdrawal of the United Nations peacekeeping mission after 20 years. Now, the Congolese government has been calling for the withdrawal of the UN peacekeepers, and it considers the UN force to be ineffective in protecting civilians from the armed groups and militias that have plagued the eastern DRC. Numerous armed groups and militia have also been active for 3 decades in the eastern DRC, and South Africa will now lead a new military force in that area. So to talk to us now about that mission and what awaits the SADF and others, we are joined virtually by an expert in African security governance and South African military and foreign policy, Professor Thomas Mandrup, who is an associate professor with the Royal Danish Defence College and with SIGLA at Stellenbosch University. Prof, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, and thank you for having me, and good morning to the viewers.
So, Professor, this is an interesting one, but of course, a conflict that has been raging for several decades now. So perhaps we can just start by having some sort of background look into what is going on, what exactly the issues are, and why, after 20 years, the United Nations have decided to withdraw and leave the DRC.
Yes, thank you for that question. One could say that, of course, the UN has been there effectively since 2002. It's a conflict that goes back to the 1990s. Some would even say to the independence of the Congo that we actually never had solved the conflict. So the UN has been there since 2002. It has played a crucial role in stabilizing the country, all that. It's been highly criticized, as you mentioned. The former president, Joseph Kabila, on several occasions called for the UN to withdraw. And now, of course, Tshisekedi, the current president, he called for the force to be withdrawn, and that's back in September. And the new mandate here from December 2023, there's an agreement and a plan for the UN force to withdraw within a year. So the force is not left Congo yet, but it will within a year start its withdrawal. And the important thing here is that they have learned from the bit of chaotic situation we see in the Mali at the moment, where the UN was forced out rapidly and left big areas, chunks of land to the rebels. Because the local authorities do not have the capacity. So here we are looking at a phased drawdown of the UN force, where they will start withdrawing down in areas where are more stable, for instance, South Kivu, and then go to start drawing down when ready, which is formulated like that, when ready, and is says to be ready from mid next year in North Kivu and in the Ituri province. As you can hear from what I'm saying, it's the conflict now is basically in the eastern part of the country. So it's basically the hotspots right now is North Kivu province next to Rwanda, and then of course the Ituri province in the north towards Uganda. And that's where we have most of the fighting. That's where the UN force has been deployed. And the problem here being, of course, that we are in an area where it is estimated we have 120 plus minus, how we would calculate them, armed groups. It's an area where there's limited of tar roads, which means that basically during rainy season it's very difficult to operate, and you can only drive a few kilometers a day. So you need air transport, you need air cover, you need to be present geographically in many locations, because the time it takes to respond to certain areas is difficult. It's a very forested and hilly area, especially in the North Kivu, which means it's easy for the opponents to hide, and the opponents, the insurgents, the militias, whatever we call them, have been in this area and operating in this area for years. So they know the terrain and they know the area.
So if we look at some of the allegations that have been leveled against the UN peacekeeping mission, with South Africa now set to lead this new military force in the DRC, what sort of challenges can they expect, given that in over 2 decades, the UN has failed to bring peace to that region?
Yeah, and it's a challenging operation, and it's again we have to remember that South Africa is still and has been part of MONUSCO, the UN force from the beginning, and South Africa is part of what we call the Force Intervention Brigade, which was deployed back in 2013 for the first time when the M23, with the biggest rebel group, the biggest threat at the moment, also when they started operating in North Kivu, and then the Force Intervention Brigade under South African lead was deployed and had successfully fought the M23 back then. So whatever we are saying that the UN is failing to do, and there's a lot of fair criticism to be raised against the UN, but sometimes it's also unfair because security in the Congo is a Congolese problem, and maybe that's the goal. That the Congolese have not been willing and capable of actually maintaining their own security, and the international forces, being the UN or the East African force or whatever that's been there, they have not been able to actually go in and take a responsibility for that kind of security, and that's maybe the biggest issue. The challenge for South Africa right now, being deployed to this area, is that we're operating in an area where you're working with local security forces with very limited capacity. It's better than it was 10 years, 15 years ago, but it still has very limited capacity. And also that you're working with a force which you're not necessarily can trust, in the sense that they sometimes collude with the opponents or the enemy, the rebel groups, and also they are very ill-disciplined and do not have a lot of military capacity. So one of the tasks the SADC force and the African force is going to have is a part of the training mission. And again, that's been something that the UN, the East Africans, and others have been doing for the last 20 years with limited impact, some impact, but limited impact. So that's one of the things. And you're operating in an area where, as I mentioned before, where the terrain is quite difficult, and it's actually you need to be able to go in and have the needed capabilities and individual capacities, military capacities, to actually go in and actually have an effective operation. That in terms of intelligence, air cover, and all these kind of things. And it's a very difficult environment. And then you are fighting and a rebel group, the M23 or the FDLR or the ADF or whatever we call them, or all these different groups, which have been operating in this area for a long time, and they know the South African forces because the South African forces have been operating there for quite some time. So that's actually, there's a lot of challenging here, and again, the biggest one here being that we are looking at a South African defense force which already is overstretched, way overstretched, basically, put it that way, and which do not have the needed sustainable capacities or capabilities in terms of air cover and all these kind of things, because the budgets has not been there for a long time, and because, as your viewers talk about, that the African Defence Force is being used for domestic policing, which was never the intended task of the Defence Force, because your police force is not working as it should.
And many of our viewers, in response to the question of the day, also point to that, the fact that the South African National Defence Force is overstretched, the fact that it is underfunded. So what role are they then likely to play with which resources? Because if you look at the SADC mission in Mozambique, for instance, that has faltered because it struggled with funding, among other things, which has hampered its operational capabilities. So talk to us about that and the risks inherent in these sort of shortcomings.
Yeah, for me, it's always, when politicians decide to deploy soldiers into an offensive operation, and this is not a peacekeeping operation. This is an offensive operation where the mandate is to go in and forcefully, together with the Congolese, to disarm first the M23, stop them and disarm them, and then go for the FDLR and maybe the ADF and forces like that. So it's an offensive operation. And to be able to do that and reduce the risk to the individual lives of the South African soldiers and also the other soldiers in the mission, you need the needed capabilities. You need a C-130 in mission to be able to do drops inside the mission of logistics when you deploy. You need another C-130 to transport logistics in and out of the mission, so we don't end up in a new Central African Republic incidents like when the South Africa deployed there and went left, we had airborne units being left there without air cover and air support. You need that kind of as well. You need attack helicopters. They were effective in 2013 against the M23. We need air rifles. You don't have them at the moment. They're not operational in the numbers you need. You need Oryx transport transport helicopters to transport your troops because the roads are so bad. So you need to be able to, you have to be able to respond fast, and you need other, robust capabilities. And then you need, of course, intelligence, and you need actionable intelligence, which means that you need actually boots on the ground that knows what's going on, so you know what you're going into and all these kind of things. At the moment, the problem is, of course, we have 1,500 troops plus deployed to Mozambique. You've got 1,200 troops deployed to MONUSCO, and the South African government has been quite insistent so far that these troops are not the ones they're going to use for the new SADC force. And then, of course, you've got 3, maybe more, 1,000 troops being deployed at all times to protect the borders. And then you have the Sama mission. And then you have a underfunded defense force, which is underfunded by far. And then you're deploying them into missions where often they do not get the money and the resources in reimbursement, so they have to cover some of the costs, or many of the costs, from these missions, from their domestic, from already overburdened budgets. So that there are so many structural issues here where it actually is difficult to see. And the problem is there's a big difference, as one of my colleagues mentioned yesterday when I had a discussion with him, there's a big difference between to being operational and effective in a mission and then just to deploy. And the risk, of course, being that Africa is going to just deploy and be there and not being effective because basically you do not have the needed capabilities to actually be effective. And I think that's a very important distinction. And then again, and my biggest issue and my biggest concern is always when you ask soldiers to go out and risk their lives for something, the politicians also need to give them the means to do so. The SADF has shown before they can do it, but you need to allow them to do it by giving them the needed resources and the capabilities, by having operational equipment, and these can need it if the politician thinks it's so important to go to the Congo. I think it's important, of course, but as it stands right now, the politician apparently refuses to prioritize. So they want to do everything. They want to do the Sama. They want to do the border ones. They want to do all these kind of things at the same time, and the defense force can simply not do this effectively with the current situation, and we need the politicians to take responsibility for this, and that's basically the government. They need to take responsibility for this.
All right.
And say either we can't do it, or we need to do it. And I think that's the biggest issue. The problem here being the risk is we end up having soldiers coming home in body bags.
Well, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, on that somber note. Thank you so much, Doctor. That was Thomas Mandrup, Associate Professor with the Royal Danish Defence College and Extraordinary Associate Professor with SIGLA, Stellenbosch University, reflecting on the new SADC intervention force in the Democratic Republic of Congo.